Welcome everybody to our event ChatGPT in Research. I'm Patrick Florén. You see the program here. A few words first about who we are and what this is about. So the Finnish Center for Artificial Intelligence brings together top research from Aalto University, University of Helsinki and VTT. Also working towards a major impact. We have funding from the Research Council of Finland in the form of a so-called flagship. And one group in FCAI is called Ethics Advisory Board. So what we do in the Ethics Advisory Board is that we support the research programs and highlights carrying out ethical discourse. I think the topic today is very topical because yesterday OpenAI released a new version of ChatGPT, ChatGPT Enterprise. And of course there has been a lot of discussion in the newspapers about ChatGPT. The University of Helsinki published directions for how to deal with ChatGPT and similar AIs in teaching. That was in February this year, and Aalto University has, during the summer, published directions both for teaching and for research. So today we will hear 3 presentations, and then we will have one panel. The panel is moderated by docent Karoliina Snell from the University of Helsinki, and she is one of the members of this Ethics Advisory Board. And I'm sure we will hear a lot about how we can use ChatGPT and also about the ethical concerns related to the use of ChatGPT. And with these words, I would like to welcome on stage Professor Hannu Toivonen from University of Helsinki to give the first presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, and good afternoon. My name is Hannu Toivonen. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Helsinki. I've been working on AI since 1990, when I joined Nokia Research, and then later at University, Nokia again, and since 2002 at the University of Helsinki. Since I'm the first speaker, I will give a very brief introduction to ChatGPT, so we are more or less on the same page, and then I'll go to the topic of ethics and uses of ChatGPT, or large language models, or AI in research. Earlier this year, Nature, the journal, published an editorial where they put focus on the threat of ChatGPT on the transparency of science. And this is, of course, a very big threat. If the transparency is endangered, then many of the good features of science, reproducibility, understandability, and so on, are at risk as well. So this as a motivation. Then, what are large language models? I presume many of you know it. What they do based on machine learning is that they predict the next word based on the previous words. So here's a simple animation trying to illustrate what's going on. Of course, it's a complex neural network in the background. It's working very fast. This is just an animation to show you how it's selecting one of the fitting words, adds it to the text, and then it can add the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And the reason for selecting any particular word is to make the text overall resemble its training data. So it's imitating texts it has seen in the training phase. ChatGPT then, again, is based on a language model, but it's much more. There are 2 points I want to make here on this slide. The first one is all that there is in ChatGPT on top of the language model. It's not just adding words based on the previous words. It's actually being tuned to answer questions, to have a chat, to follow instructions, to trying to be safe. That means to avoid bad language, violence, sexual expressions, and so on. It's been tuned to feel natural for humans. It's been tuned to be exhaustive in its answers, to be polite, and so on, and so on, and so on. So it's not strictly just a language model. The second point I want to make here is that just like ChatGPT has been built based on a language model, a lot of different tools can be built on language models. So I think today our focus should not be on ChatGPT alone, or if it is, let's take it as an example of the kind of tools that are and will be available for science and researchers. Then, what is a language model? Anyone? What is a language model? Surprise, it's a model of language. This is a crucial point. Language model is a model of language. It's not a model of the world. A language model deals with words, not facts or information. It looks at statistical distribution of words. It does not do reasoning on any of the content. It looks at strings without understanding the meanings of those strings. It has no access to any meaning at all besides how words co-work together in the training text. So we need to keep the expression, the language, separate from the content that this text conveys. Now, language models, since they are models of a language, they can be very good at dealing with language, with textual expressions. But since they don't work on the content, they can be very bad at that. As we all know, they can be convincing in producing text that seems legit, but there are no guarantees. And this is something we should keep in mind. We can find, I think, and we have found many good uses for these tools that are based on its ability to process language, but we shouldn't use them, or should use with caution only for any tasks. Can you hear me? No? So language models, we should look for applications and uses where we can build on their strength to process language, to process text, without processing the content. And for applications where processing content is needed, we should then be very critical and, I guess in most cases, not use tools like ChatGPT. If we make the mistake of letting large language models produce content, things can go badly wrong. There are sad examples from science, papers being retracted because they've turned out to be nonsense produced by language models. The same happens in news. Because they don't work with knowledge and facts, and they don't do any actual reasoning in the sense that we do, they are prone to produce results that are riddled with errors and also substantially plagiarized. So just highlighting a couple of the ethical problems that might arise from the use of ChatGPT or other opaque tools to produce something for us. Okay, but let me move on. Instead of being just critical about language models, what good might they be able to do as scientists? So a couple of examples, just quickly. First, they might help us write better papers, not by producing the text for us, but doing useful things. Language models are, if you allow the metaphor, experts on language. So let them work on the language. Style, structure, let them improve that. The content is mine, but the tool helps me improve the presentation. And there are existing tools for this using large language models, maybe other methods as well. They can be useful in checking my paper for correct formatting for a journal, maybe checking for transparency, repeatability, and so on. These checks are, of course, superficial because they don't understand the text, but they can be useful in checking if these things are covered and how well they are covered. And the tools, giving us examples here, do some of that. They can be useful in technical formatting, like here, for those of you who are from natural sciences, computer science, mathematics, this might look familiar. Producing technical coding for certain things might be useful, like for LaTeX. Automated format adjustments and so on. So in all of this, the content is mine, but the tools help me express it in a better way or help me check things out. And with ChatGPT, you can think of many ways of asking and getting feedback on your own text, for instance. Writing, but also reading. Reading papers is something we need to do when we embark on research. Here's one example about detection of key points in a given article. So this tool, I give it the document, and it highlights those places that, according to the model, are the key points in this paper. This might make it easier for me to skim through the paper, and it's not usually extremely critical if it's exactly right or not, but it might help me get an understanding of the paper more quickly than I might do otherwise. Similarly, there are tools for producing summaries of papers, for answering questions about the given paper, and so on. So just a couple of examples of how large language models, AI, might be helpful for us scientists in reading and writing. So Nature said they will give 2 ground rules, and the ground rules are here. The first one is that a large language model cannot act as an author because it's software, and software doesn't have any accountability. The authors must take responsibility, full responsibility for the paper. So only human authors who actually did the work and take the accountability are listed as authors. And the second ground rule is that any use of large language models must be documented. That adds to the transparency of science, how things were done, but of course leaves many doors open depending on how the language models were used. If you can actually tell what they did, why they did, what are the arguments and reasoning behind any of the results, because that's lacking. So to wrap up, the main question for me here really is where and how could we use opaque software? So not just large language models, but any opaque software which does not allow us to know what went on inside, to help research in a way that we still can maintain the transparency and trustworthiness of science. So, thank you.
Thank you, Hannu. Any questions from the audience? Now it's like a really good time to ask from actual expert. No?
Minna.
Then you can ask. Yes.
Minna.
Minna.
Yes. I hadn't thought about the reading aspect, and this seems to me like this could be a huge help. So think about grant proposals, for instance. So could there be a tool that kind of condenses us the fundability of a research proposal?
I'm not sure if there can be one that does that fully, but I think there are tools that can help us get the ideas from different papers. There's always the risk that the summaries and the synthesis are not correct. So you need to still take the responsibility yourself and check things out. But it might help getting started.
Yeah.
I ask one question also to you because I saw a lot of different applications there. There were like tens of names. Is it enough just to run a ChatGPT? What's your feeling about that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Can we just use ChatGPT? Why use 10 different applications? Is it ChatGPT good enough as it is?
Right. So you might use ChatGPT for many of these applications instead of tools, but I think usually the tailored tools do much better job in what they've been designed for, and there's a lot of tuning that you can and often must do on top of ChatGPT, training it with your own data, prompting it for specific instructions for the task and so on. So if somebody has done that for you, it's likely to work better than you trying to do it yourself. Sometimes the context length might be a limit and you need separate tools that can handle and kind of remember longer documents or several of them for your queries.
Great, thank you. Now we're going to move. We have more questions at the end, so don't worry. We're going to move now. Perttu Hämäläinen from Aalto University. We're switching the mix. Please go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I'm going to talk about a case study mostly about generating and analyzing research data with large language models. And this presentation is mostly based on this paper we published in April this year with Mikke Tavast and I as the shared first authors. Mikke is also there. Hi. And yeah, actually wanted to say this is the first time I'm giving a kind of work talk with my wife in the audience. So kind of thanks, Tiedekulma, I guess. Yeah, so the paper builds on two others we published in the same way. We started this research about 2 years ago when we got access to GPT-3, which, as Hannu told us, is a kind of ancestor of ChatGPT and GPT-4. And our main research question was, can language models simulate or role-play humans in responding to questionnaires or interviews? And I mean simulate here on a behavioral level. We make no claims about the kind of internal workings of the models. And how we go about this is we craft a prompt that is framed like a research interview and ask a language model to continue it. So let's walk through a simple example. We can start the prompt like this. Then we can add some demographic info, and then we can add the question and leave the participant response out. And now a model trained to continue text in a plausible manner will try to generate a response for the participant. And the point here is that these models, when they're trained on basically all of the internet, they learn to mimic many kind of voices, and the prompt can elicit different voices. So that's what makes this even like somehow possible that this could work. And okay, here's a continuation that GPT-3 gave me. So okay, again, we are talking about GPT-3, the kind of old model now, because we didn't have yet access to ChatGPT back then. And this is fairly plausible. And the model also automatically generated a follow-up question and answer. And obviously, this can be a convenient way to quickly explore some initial research ideas and questions. I wouldn't use this for actual research because the models are known to make all kind of mistakes, and therefore any findings you might get from this kind of synthetic data, you should validate those with real data. And in this paper, we focused on a case of experiencing video games as art for a number of reasons. First, there was a reference real human data set available from my colleagues that was from a recent study that, based on the dates, we knew that GPT-3 hadn't been trained on. And secondly, I think that experiencing something as art is such a kind of profoundly human thing that it's kind of interesting for AI modeling. And this idea is kind of obvious, and it happened that about at the same time as our paper, a couple of others came out, so people had been working on this independently, and this paper, for instance, tests the same approach in the domain of political science. There's also already at least one startup commercializing this kind of approaches, so doing user research without the users, as they claim. A bit more about this later. So, in our paper, we had 3 experiments, and in this experiment, we asked human participants to try and guess whether a question answer was from a real human or GPT-3. And the key result was that, on average, GPT responses were slightly more often evaluated as human-written than actual real human texts. And we don't fully know why this is, but Mikke did some analysis on that, and possibly the GPT-3 texts, based on some keyword analysis, were actually more emotional, and this might be something that people don't expect from an AI. In another experiments, we looked more closely at the similarities and differences in the real and synthetic data using an AI-assisted qualitative data coding approach. Here's a visualization of the code groups found in both, on the left, the human, and on the right, the GPT-3 data. Of course, we can't see anything here, so let's zoom in and show this as a table format. So one can see that the most frequent themes discussed in both data are quite similar. So far, so good. However, we also ran some quantitative metrics and found this odd thing. Here, from left to right, there are different GPT-3 variants with growing model size. And we see that the distance between synthetic and real decreases, so the largest variant, the Da Vinci one, performs best. However, we also tested this later variant that is just as big, but it has been fine-tuned with human feedback, and it performs much worse in this case. So what is happening? After some extra analysis, it turns out that the more recent model was giving very high-quality answers, but instead of representing the diversity of real humans, it was almost always repeating the single high-quality answer. And this can be explained because this model was, this is from the Instruct GPT series in Hannu's slides, so this had been fine-tuned with human feedback, and basically the fine-tuning objective can be optimized if the model always gives the single best answer to a particular question. So it's kind of working as intended, but in this modeling human samples, it's wrong. Here's a concrete example. 4% of the real data talked about the game Journey, which is widely recognized as art. The original GPT-3 was 25% of the answers were about Journey, and then the later fine-tuned model was 85% Journey, so almost always the same game. More details can be found in a paper. So to recap, some ethical issues. Although these models can be convenient as simulated participants to some exploration of research ideas, diversity can be a big issue. Well, there's nothing new in this, but we now have some quantitative data on this. And it was interesting to see that the later and supposedly better models, they are much worse in this respect. I don't have the same data from ChatGPT yet, but based on how it's trained, I would expect it's kind of the same. And really the old GPT-3 that OpenAI is now discontinuing, it's a bit chaotic, but it can really talk in many more different voices, whereas ChatGPT is it has this kind of mansplaining, one note, kind of annoying voice to me. Yeah, so based on this, I think that synthetic users with this claim, test your idea or product with AI and take decisions with confidence. This is quite strong claim. So I'm not that sold yet. Although I don't know the details. Maybe they have good validation in place. Another problem is that even biased AI responses can fool human participants, so they can be very hard to detect. And therefore, I think that our honeymoon with these online services like Mechanical Turk and Prolific is kind of over. So these are services where you can easily recruit a lot of participants for your questionnaire studies, for instance. Just click of a mouse button, credit card in, you get 300 responses in an hour. But because these platforms reward their participants for answering quickly, they might start now using ChatGPT to speed up the work. And anecdotally, I've heard colleagues already getting these kind of answers in Prolific, and these are only the obvious ones that get caught. So I wouldn't trust that kind of data really anymore. So it's kind of back to lab studies for psychologists and player experience researchers and so on. So because of all these problems, I'm not really pushing the data generation further right now. I'm more focusing on developing this AI-assisted qualitative analysis pipeline we built initially for the paper. And the tool is open source and can be found on GitHub already. Few words about this. I have about a minute to go. So using this tool, one defines the coding style using a few examples. Usually around 10 examples already provide good results, and the model can extrapolate from there. And one can also code more data manually for a test set or validation set, and then we have a distance metric that helps you to sort and see the worst case code. So these are the worst case results from that data set where the AI codes differ most from the human codes. And here, for instance, human has noted that the participant made this kind of categorical statement, all games are art, and the AI missed it. Here, again, then the human coder had missed some points made in a very long answer, possibly because they were tired. In comparison, the AI doesn't get tired, so it can be, to some degree, even better in this coding task. The coding can be really interesting, digging deeper in your data and seeing what is there, but to my experience, it quite soon can become kind of tedious and your brain gets numb and you lose your focus. And here's a visualization. Would it start playing? Does it work? Okay, so this is a visualization produced by the tool. So these are themes and code. So every dot is a code, and then by going over the code with the mouse, you can see the theme and the original data from which this code originates from. And there are clusters like, for instance, this is about reflection, how a game makes you reflect, and therefore people feel it's art. Okay, in summary, these models can simulate human participants and help in piloting research ideas, but diversity can be lacking. Another problem is that synthetic data is hard to detect, and therefore we cannot trust data from a source where we can't monitor that it's an actual human answering the questionnaire or somehow producing the data. On the positive side, I think the kind of data analysis is much more promising and doesn't have these ethical risks, and it's a kind of more suitable task for these language models, because it's just like taking things that are there, extracting, summarizing, that sort of thing. So thank you.
Thank you, Perttu. We have now, yet again, time for questions from the audience. There's one.
Thank you. The output of the large language models is dependent on the prompt. So are these responses that you've studied the output of the default prompt, or have you modified it somehow? Because,
Pardon? Can you repeat the question about the prompt specifically?
So as an example, in GPT-4 or ChatGPT-4, whatever it's called, there's now a possibility to instruct the model how you want to be answered. So you can put down the researcher, right. Blah, blah, blah. So did you use the default output, or did you prompt it in anyhow, or did you just take the output?
I'm not sure if I have a slide. So in the beginning, I gave this example. But in this study, we basically replicated the questions from the original data that collected the human data. We just prefixed that with the kind of, this is a transcript from a research interview, the participant is this and that, and then there's kind of some warm-up questions that you would ask a human, just to kind of nudge the old GPT-3 model, because it kind of needs longer prompt to work well. We didn't use the newer ChatGPT, and the old one doesn't have the system prompt. Maybe you were also referring to that. So the old one doesn't even have that. So yeah, the paper fully documents the prompts we used.
Other questions? Over there. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. Just curious about the metric you applied for measuring the distances between the sentences.
Yeah, so that's based on because you can map the codes to this embedding space, and then they kind of, for each response, a human can give a number of codes, AI can give number of codes. They are not because this is inductive coding, so they are not from a fixed code book, and they can be any number. So they're kind of point clouds. So we're borrowing point cloud distance metrics from computer vision for this task.
Okay. If it's a short question, then yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a lot of, this was a very provoking presentation for me, but can I ask just a snippet of a very, very big, broad area that you're bringing up here? You're talking about ethical questions, which to me seem very small, considering what is done here to people as research subjects. So have you thought about what this is actually doing to what we think that interviewing is? Because if you basically think that people are just you need to extract some words from them, and it doesn't really matter what they are saying or whatever. I'm just thinking that what is this kind of user research where you just need some text that is then analyzed, and it's supposed to mean what? Well,
maybe this particular kind of study that we were kind of replicating, it tried to understand why people experience video games as art. So it's this kind of psychological research question, kind of. And in that study, they also had some quantitative questionnaires, but then the qualitative data analysis was based on this. So it's typically these studies are kind of mixed methods, and you take interview or open-ended question data and derive some, well, in qualitative researches, you derive basically hypotheses that you might validate with quantitative. So it's this, I don't know, am I answering you? It's often psychological or, yeah. So what is the use of the data is maybe, for instance, I use these study results in my game design teaching. I'm a game design teacher, so it's good for game makers to understand what their players experience.
Okay, thank you. We'll continue with the more ethics questions more. Thank you, Perttu. And as FCAI is comprised of University of Helsinki, Aalto University, and also VTT, now we have our last speaker, Arash from VTT. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. Really happy to be here. My name is Arash Hajikhani. I have actually two hats. I'm at VTT Technical Research Center as a research team leader, and also an adjunct professor at Lappeenranta University of Technology. My previous week was very much with generative AI. I was conducting a workshop on the university, giving a hands-on exercise. And then I realized that people are coming to this topic from a very diverse backgrounds. And therefore, when I was thinking about this venue, I thought that, again, diverse audience, which is great. So in a way, I'm trying to put snippets from what I'm seeing and what type of change is happening. In a way, if I draw on a spectrum of full enthusiasm to more like a disappointment. I'm somewhere near the enthusiasm part, but I keep reminding myself that, there are considerations we have to think very truthfully. There's a lot of impacts happening with this. Some of the very fresh data I can also share with you. We ran a larger scale survey in Finland, basically Finnish workforce, just before summer. It was in May. Kind of a bad timing. You get like a mixed type of response rates. But we were very excited to pick up what is this impacting the Finnish workforce? And some of the numbers, if I want to share with you, 35% of people indicated that their productivity is impacted positively by utilizing generative AI in their work. And surprisingly enough, or maybe not surprisingly enough, we had a question about how people feel that their job or part of their job will be replaced by generative AI. And again, we could indicate and infer some meaningful associations there. That report will come later, probably in September, so please tune in. It's very much towards the Finnish workforce and how Finland as an economy and a country responds to these developments. But then coming back to my presentation, I was very grateful to listen to the previous presenters. In a way, it's, as a last presenter, it's hard to, adjust like what content to deliver. I hope that there's not much of an overlap and we can have a nice debate because I have a different standpoints on some of the matters been discussed. But generally, on large language models, whenever you talk about them, it's not all about GPT or OpenAI offering. We're talking basically about more than 400 language models that currently now been out there to use. So it's a very, very vast amount of tools coming around with the language models. Some of the very well-known ones you probably heard, like the Google Bard, Bing, Cloud by Anthropic, and GPT-4. And by many benchmarks, these tools are good at certain things, not good at other things. For example, Bard is based on Palm, eventually has shown a better response rate for like medical type of questions, while GPT is not as accurate as Palm 2 Bard is. And this is very much dependent on the type of data they have been trained on, in what scale, and oftentimes these commercial tools are not very transparent on the data that you use, so it's very difficult to infer basically what they are good at. And then later on in these experiments and the benchmarkings done by open community, you get to realize what they are good at. And more, as we are progressing in time, we see that the open source community is really catching up. One of the very latest development is a language model, a derivative of Llama, which is called Godzilla. Nice naming. It's really getting a lot of attention, and it's kind of gaining a lot of benchmarks and good points for that. So it's a very volatile domain. A lot of progress are happening. And sooner or later, we will see that it's not only about the ChatGPT, there are other models are coming to the space. One of the snippets, this is an interaction of me with the ChatGPT to kind of show you that, when we talk about the language model, what it really means. And this is about, I have the application on my phone, so I interact with it very often, and as well as the work and, the normal kind of interactions. I asked it, what is this term in Finnish for summer yard cleaning? As a language learner, I always wanted to, refer to my progress with the Finnish language, and it's not the easiest one, so it's always good to get back to it and get some advices from it. So I use it as a language tool as well. So regarding my query, it came back to me as this kesanpihan sivous, which wasn't exactly the thing that I was looking for. And then I started to elaborate more that, well, I heard the term before, but that's not it. So I, again, expanded the context. So I elaborated further that, what is this exact thing that, these housing associations, or as in Finnish called uhtio, used for shared area cleaning and yard, which ends up in partying and grilling and drinking. So eventually, this is maybe not universal for all the experiences you might have, but at least in our housing association, this is the practice. And then it was very much to the point. It referred to me talcode, which this is the word that I've heard before. So you can think about it that this is not a a Google search query. This cannot be replicated by the tools that we are used to. This is far beyond, it cannot understand context. And in this particular case, the only way I could maintain such an interaction is with a human. But eventually I have done it with AI. And it was very much to the point. So just as an idea that, you know, when we talk about language model, they're very good at picking up context. And that also is a way of scouting information. Coming more to the academic side, these tools also show a lot of power to democratize the participation in science. You know, in the world we are living in, 95% of the populations are not native speakers of English. So these tools eventually have the power to bridge these language gaps and eventually leads to more robust, diverse, and collaborative type of discussions. And this is very powerful. Then some of the other examples, these tools also shown a lot of potential to summarize and help us to understand complicated text. And when I'm referring to that is, for example, reading legal documents. Eventually those documents are very complicated and it's really hard and very long. For a good reason, they have been written very long and cumbersome that you don't get really much engaged with it. But next time when you're installing a software or you are giving a consent to a tool or whatever you're adapting in your routine, try it out. Probably ask it and prompt it in a way that what type of rights I'm giving out? What are the discussion points? What should be I aware about it? And you will get surprised that so much important information there are there that we just skip, we don't get involved with it because it's a long text. We need some assistance. The other interaction I had was, I call it the trip to the future. I wrote about it in LinkedIn as a post. I was walking in a library and I realized that, there was a multiple choice of, what book should I pick up? There are a lot of shelves, there's a lot of content. I'm very excited to, look at many things. But that led to a discussion with the ChatGPT in a way that I have certain questions and then I was thinking about it and then I ended up chatting with the tool, looking at the discussion and the answers coming from it. So that was very engaging and interesting. And sometimes you realize that because these tools are using the data from Common Crawl or many of the published books in the open repository, they already have a lot of background knowledge within themselves. And when you start interacting with them about a certain topic or a certain book, you get, again, surprises that this is actually giving me feedback and responses from that particular content. Again, we have to realize that, these tools are baseline models. They're very good at comprehending language, and therefore they can be used to create assisted tools. And this is something that I have done it for myself and put it also outsourced for others to use it. It's basically to create a kind of a coach for giving goals and success indicators, especially when you're, like myself as a team leader, when you're trying to define how to measure progress in certain direction within your team or organizations. You often need certain triggers or goals or success measures. And these are oftentimes not very easy to understand because you are definitely missing a lot of context. But these language models eventually are, if trained a little bit, provided a little bit background, they offer a good guidelines into harmonize experiences. Like, for example, how to create goals and measure success measures for a certain objective. At least it gives good ideas. I'm not saying 100% that I was super excited with all the responses, but it was a baseline for me to get some ideas where to go next. As I said earlier, it is very useful, the way I find it and many others, to condense complex details. We often know that great research relies on great ideas, and in order to get great ideas, you need to expand this horizon for capturing inputs. And referring to the presentations of the previous presenters, these are again very good at comprehending a lot of context. So if you're about to get an understanding about a particular subject, and there's a lot has been said on that subject elsewhere, these tools could offer a very good path to condense, summarize, extract themes, and then compare themes. And this is something that we have also been using a lot. It shows a lot of power. You can save a lot of time, and eventually shows a good robustness measures as well. The other point about exploring diverse perspective with AI. This is something that oftentimes researchers, we are condemned to be very narrow, having a narrow perspective, basically looking at our own immediate community and the impact that we immediately can have. But oftentimes, I realize that using, for example, ChatGPT or generative AI, it can, broaden your horizon, basically asking about it as an expert about a certain topic that provide a concise list of diverse perspective, considering like other viewpoints. So in a way, it gives you another set of ideas that what could be the vantage point that you're not immediately considering. And this is giving you certain ideas to understand and involve certain diversity and certain audience in your approach. And I'm sure that you probably can relate to me that there oftentimes we don't realize how our research can impact others because we are not necessarily considering that areas immediately. And then one of the very popular use cases, I've seen it with myself and my immediate close proximity colleagues, is that not necessarily, using it as a proofreader, because there are things that you would like to check. And of course, as an individual, you want to learn as well. You want to gain something from that experience. So the way I have been using it is to that guide me, how can I improve my writing style? So in a way, when I'm giving you a text, analyze it, be as an expert proofreader, and tell me how can I improve that text. And this eventually, I find it very powerful because in this process, I am involved as an author, and at the same time, this can give me certain hints that I can improve my writing style. And for example, in this one instance, I was very excited that it is recommending me to replace jargon with similar language. And this is something that probably I don't immediately notice. If I'm writing for my community and I write about natural language processing, I'm expecting that everybody know what that is. But eventually it is suggesting me that maybe replace that with language understanding tools. And the reason is that simplifying technical terms makes the content more accessible to wider audience. I mean, it sounds very simple, but so many times you kind of miss these simple ideas. And when it comes from such a tool, very accessible, I think it's very powerful. In another instance, I mean, we talk about complex information processing. This is an article we have written, and it is in a review process. In that article, we have certain methodological steps, and then there are tables that if you're not necessarily an econometrician, you probably have difficult times interpreting such tables. But again, these tools can come as an assist. So basically, by dropping such a content or such a table, you can ask that, interpret that table to me as a 5-year-old, or whatever language you can imagine to have. And they are very to the point. I mean, I have the background to say that this is accurate, and the next time I really don't have the stamina to go through a very long table to look for a certain thing, I might do the same. It really elaboratively describes what is within the table, and then, the chat power. It feels that you're sitting with the author with an econometrician background, and you're asking that, okay, what can you tell me about this? What is there in that table to me? And I have a certain question, and then, because again, they are offering these chat experiences. They have a memory. You can always, chat with them. But at the same time, I can also highlight that the quality is the matter. There has been a research earlier on the point that why ChatGPT is getting dumber at a basic math, and then there was a discussion about the drifting. So over time, eventually, researchers found out that the quality we get from these models are not consistent. The more they are trained on certain aspects, it's more of a trade-off. And then It's kind of impacts some other aspects. And we also have written a piece about kind of having a critical review on these language models. Eventually, it was not performing on a certain task that we had a very established machine learning model for identifying certain thing. So at the same time, I would like to highlight that not every task can be achieved nicely by just utilizing language models, because they are probably not the best solution for everything. And oftentimes when you use these language models, we are missing a lot of nuances because it's a black box. We don't have a lot of control. However, with other, for example, machine learning approaches, we have more control as humans to insert our capabilities or future tuning and things like that. So at the end, I would like to leave you with some provoking questions. There are not definitive answers for these, but they are very highly debated. I had to review some 100 articles to arrive to these very few condensed thought-provoking questions. The ethics in AI. So we kind of see that as AI decisions hold ethical implications, how do we align them with social values? And this is important. You can see that AI is penetrating to many of our processes. Soon, AI is defining certain decision on our application to whatever system it is. And then all the ethical questions, being balance, being justice, comes to the perspective. The fact about bias in AI, with large language models inheriting bias from training data, and this is evidented, how can we prevent perpetuating these biases? So this again requires certain understanding, certain learning curves to understand how these models are compiled, and by using them, realizing what sort of advantages and what sort of disadvantages we are gaining from them. Dependency on AI, another important aspect that we are eventually relying more and more on the LLMs. We might risk diminishing our own cognitive abilities. And this is important because if you get to work with certain things with the assistance of these tools, then you might ask question about how I am performing as a researcher if so much of my work is automated. Misinformation, another point. Eventually I have to proceed faster as the time is due, but the content authenticity, again, AI produces vast amount of content, but what does originality truly means? I gave you an example about the proofreader. In another way, I can ask it and say that, look at this article, for example, in Guardian, and just transform my text to the style of that Guardian article. So then you could ask that, what about is there a copyright issue here? What about the originality with that journalist who crafted that article so nicely, and I'm using a language model to just transform my not very exciting text to that kind of a content. Collaboration versus isolation, I think that was one of the comments came from the audience, that while we use these tools, how we avoid AI-generated echo chambers and retain basically the diverse human perspective. In a way, you can get a lot of things automated and done with these tools, but at the same time, we humans, we like to collaborate, we like to talk with each other. So what are the downfalls or negative points about it? So I leave you with that. Thank you very much. I also have content on LinkedIn about certain practices on prompting and how to do it and how not to do it. So feel free to follow me in Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm happy to be engaged in the discussion with you in those channels as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arash. Now we have still time for a question or some from the audience before the panel discussion starts.
I have a lot of questions. Just a small clarification. We're talking about productivity gains of 35%. This was not large language models, but AI in general, or was it due to language models?
This is referring to the language models. So
well, I'm interested. Where does it come from? 35% seems quite a bit. So could you elaborate a little bit?
Well, this is actually another study on MIT has also indicated that. But in a survey, we are trying to ask the participants how they are engaged with using language models in their work. And the very draft initial numbers are indicating that 30 to 35% are seeing productivity gains when they're involving these tools in their normal routines. And when I'm talking about the Finnish workforce, it's a big range. We're having like researchers from ICT sector to public administrations and so on and so forth. And then, of course, you see variations within them, but overall, that number is indicative.
What's the productivity gain? Was the question, right?
I mean, the question has been framed in a way that do the participants, like if somebody is using generative AI, do they see certain productivity gain in their work? And then we have a Likert scale that they indicate on a Likert scale.
Okay. Other questions? If not, we'll move to the panel discussion. So I invite all the speakers here. Thank you. And we'll be switching mics a bit. Okay, so thank you very much. We had now several viewpoints to ChatGPT, etc., large language models, how they can be used in research. And we found out that they can be a sort of tools. They can be for helping a researcher to generate something. They can be also tools to generate data. And they can be co-authors, etc. There are many ways of using this. And you highlighted some sort of a different ethical aspect. But if you would like to come back, most of the audience is researchers, and this is how to use ChatGPT, etc. in research. What is the sort of a most pressing or sort of an ethical viewpoint that the researchers should take when embarking or thinking about embarking on using this in research?
Well, I think the bottom line is that as a scientist, we have to take accountability of the work that we publish. So whatever tools I use, I need to be fully confident that I completely understand what has gone on, what's the reasoning, what are the arguments. So when I put my name on top of the paper, I really need to know what went in, regardless of the tools that I used. So in case I did use any black box models like large language models for something, I just can't rely on that output. I need to work things out for myself.
Yeah, not much to add. So transparency, reproducibility, so that others can also verify, because yeah, especially with black box models, because you don't know exactly what's happening inside, it's easy to make basically human mistakes in the process, and then it's good that others can rerun your analysis or regenerate your data and try for themselves and see if there are errors, I guess.
One of the very evident trends is that these language models are, as a base model, are coming into different pipelines, and then those transform to be more of the tools that are very much doing everything. Like one of the examples are the code interpreters that ChatGPT offered, in a way that you dump a kind of a data, and then you start asking questions, and then a lot of things come out. And one of the dangers is that. Again, this is like my approach, that always breaking down questions and the requests always helps the researcher or a practitioner to have control over the whole process. When you have a lot of complexity within your request, it's really hard to debug what is really happening. And in a way, I don't feel that they are so to the point at the moment, and this is the discussion now. Maybe next year we are having a different perspective. But as of now, it's really important to be on board as a researcher, and that requires to really break down the questions and the requests, whatever we are asking from it. If it's like a code snippets, it's good to really break it down and try to maintain and understand what it is doing, rather than having a complicated task that is really hard to debug. That okay, what is really happening down the hood?
Yeah, maybe I could add that it's often quite easy to write a bit of validation code yourself on top of. So maybe often it's don't use ChatGPT as is or a language model as is, but make it, for instance, if you interrogate it about a PDF, like ChatPDF lets you ask questions about a paper, but then you don't really know if the answers are right, if it's correctly represented, but you could ask it to produce quotes to support its argumentation, and then you could write yourself a bit of Python code, for instance, that checks that the quotes are actually correct and from the paper. And I wouldn't use that kind of tool unless it provides that kind of post-process validation of the results.
Well, I'm a social scientist, sociologist, been doing qualitative research. I do code with the help of technology, not only using like the markers. Mm-hmm. But am I the loser in this? Like, do I have to really learn Python? Is this for everybody? Will it be like serving all the fields, or do I really have to become a computer scientist actually to utilize?
I think you don't, if I can continue answering, because this is kind of my home turf. By the way, I'm just kind of learning to be a qualitative researcher. I'm kind of migrating and finding myself asking more and more questions where those methods can help answering. So I'm not super experienced yet, a couple papers in. But yeah, I and others, we are trying to build the tools so that you can use it without coding, and make them open source so that somebody who has the knowledge can go and verify that it's working as it should. And I think in any kind of like automation, this is form of automation, we should not be just thinking about productivity, but quality of life, whether you find satisfaction in your work. So I wouldn't say don't code your data anymore, but code it as long as you feel it's meaningful. And then if it becomes too tedious that you can't do it, then offload to AI, only at this point. Because then you have also generated a lot of manual reference that you can use to validate the results. That's like my view on this.
You don't have to be a computer scientist to use a language model. The fact is that computer scientists don't understand really fully what goes on in there, so we are not in a better position than you. But the bad news here is that it's so easy to use. The threshold to use it is so low. You just type in something and you get something back. Kids have it in their phones, like Snapchat has it since earlier this year already, so anyone can access it immediately. And it makes things feel so easy. That's the problem. Mm-hmm. So that's why many of us are also emphasizing the criticism, to be critical about its outputs and not trusting anything that it produces. So the good advice for many applications is that you have to be able to check the output. Maybe you can do something automatically, like like Perttu has shown, but in many cases you have to be on top of the topic in order to be able to see if the result is actually useful or not. If you use it for producing code, if you are not a computer scientist, you might use it for producing program code. Bad idea. You have to know programming to be able to check if the code makes sense or not. You might be able to run it, but maybe it doesn't do exactly what you intended. But if you are trained in programming, you might be able to check it quickly and see if it makes sense, or ask ChatGPT for corrections to your code when you see that there are issues.
Mm-hmm. If I want to add, it's a very empowering tool. I had a slide on democratization in a way that certain barriers are not there anymore. If I want to give also some facts, people who do code, they know probably Stack Overflow. That's basically a repository. When you are hitting to a dead end, you go and ask the community to, find a solution. And they have, even now, experiencing a very low traffic, site traffic. People are not visiting that anymore, and this is one of the challenges in Stack Overflow headquarters, that they're thinking that how they should mitigate this. Because language models are replacing it. People are now returning to the language models asking code questions, like if you get an error, you get it fixed. And then the power is that you can also get an understanding why it didn't work. So it's very educational. So at the same time, while you don't necessarily need to be a computer scientist, you can very much smoothly integrate to the coding experience by having a tutor just sitting by you and walking you through the whole process, letting you to understand. But if you don't even have a stamina to learn things, you just can't get things done if you can still manipulate and understand what it is doing, which is good to have that power. Otherwise, you're exposed to the problems that it might generate sometimes.
I do like your point of democratization, that it sort of empowers. But then, pushing a bit further, I think it might also, there's a discussion like how what ChatGPT can produce is not, it can be very biased, it can be also very oriented towards English-speaking males, etc. But also, if it helps us to speak English, if it helps us to write in English, it also helps us to think in English. So in a way, even though it brings us the possibilities, it must actually just make us do it in a similar manner and not sort of support the other ways of thinking or something. This is what I'm sort of always thinking when I'm looking at AI apps, etc. Like they're putting me in a format. Is this what you see, or do you see it better?
If I want to respond to part of it, certain tasks like coding, where there is a very structured framework, these language models are very little tuned into biases, because you have a certain instructions, you wanted to do a certain task, you want to scale it, and that's a very kind of a followable instructions where it can extrapolate on a coding language. However, in the content, you're totally right. And this is why, there is a reason why there's a multiplicity of these language models, because they are reflecting the values and the properties that on the data that they have been trained on. And this is reflective. Like, for example, some language models, you find it very bad on Finnish, but some are much better because the training data has been much better quality for a certain language. And this is something, again, which opens up, we're not going to a final solution, like a final language model for everything. It's going to be more specialized. For example, if you want to have a debate on medical matters or philosophy, there will be a language model which is more expert on that.
I like the positive attitude of Arash, but I'm maybe more pessimistic. I fully agree with your statement of the problems. There are so many sources of bias and injustice and in language models, and many of those are very difficult for us to see. Just thinking of ChatGPT maybe works in 100 languages, and there are 6,000-7,000 languages in the world. So actually much of the world is outside the reach of these tools. And it's great, just like Arash said, there are more and more are being developed, and that's great. But at the moment, we are really dominated in language models by these tech giants. One big issue is that these systems are fully opaque. We don't know how they've been trained, how they've been fine-tuned, how they are being directed to act. We might think that they appear objective in some matters, in some others not, but we can't really know, we can't really trust. And that's a major issue, I think.
Yeah, I agree, except that now open source models, a few of them at least are emerging. So Meta's Llama initiative is really valuable in this sense that about these models we do have those details. Then again, the problem is that, for instance, the fine-tuning data, there's so much of it that one can't comprehend it. It's there in theory for anyone to check, but then you would need to do, again, an AI-based analysis to get a grasp of what's going on and what biases are there, because the data sets are so large. Yeah. I guess, can I comment on the education part, because you were talking about that they are teaching us to think and write English and so on. I just want to say I'm really excited in principle about the educational possibilities and what Khan Academy is doing with, together with OpenAI. So Khan Academy is this online learning platform providing a lot of free quality content. And they are basically trying to solve Benjamin Bloom's 2 sigma problem, which was posed in the 80s, that basically if you could provide personal tutoring to each student, you could kind of shift their knowledge or skills to standard deviations to the good direction, so average students would kind of become exceptional in a sense, but of course it's not economical. And they have some really promising demos on this, that the way they have fine-tuned and trained language models to be those tutors. But again, it's limited to certain languages. There's this downside of it, so I'm really divided on this topic.
I'm going to shortly open the question to the floor as well. But also, when you think about you're expert, you know how to evaluate, perhaps, let's see, what is a black box, what could be trustworthy, what is more open. And to me, when we start thinking about, for example, Patrick referred to that University of Helsinki has now the sort of guidelines of how to use AI in teaching. But as a researcher, if I'm starting to use or wanting to use, I feel like a bit overwhelmed and would need help. You refer to the community that can actually help solving sort of problems when you're sort of trying to get forward with using AI to your help. But should we, and are there, Hannu, you refer to the sort of the guidelines by nature that what you should say and how you should use AI or not when you're publishing Nature, and there are other guidelines, but what kind of support there could be? Do we need, are there guidelines, are there support, like not to leave the individual researcher like trying to answer all these questions, like can I use this one, does my data go to China, will everything be ruined, is this totally biased? I feel I don't know how to answer these questions. So what kind of help there is, or should we sort of develop some guidelines or assistance for this?
I can start. I think there's not a definite answer to that question, but of course one of the approaches is that this is something that it's emerging, and people are realizing that there are powerful applications, there are considerations. The only way to get to know these better is by using them, learn how to use them, and by knowing how they function, how they respond, that also gives us a better understanding, how we can control their behavior or their kind of way of solving certain problems. That also invites to be a bit more transparent about it. Even in our survey, we were asking that, how openly people discuss about it in the workplace, and that wasn't very open, as we realized, because companies still are really figuring out what it is. Many companies don't really, have a certain policy on how these things should be used, and that kind of leaves a void that, okay, we shouldn't use it. And people, out of curiosity, they might end up using it, but because it's not a very open environment to share, then this collective learning is not happening. We have to admit that these things exist. Many are benefiting from it. I mean, we are living in a world full of competition. So if we kind of really close our eyes and say that, okay, we don't deal with it, what about the competition? We are competing. And if we are not training our next generation or our workforce, then this will come back to us with a bit of a more of a kind of force. So again, there are a lot of indication that reskilling, upskilling is needed because we're going to work in a different environment. And the only way is to, really engage with it and have a patience, because first interaction might not be always very to the point. And I have seen a lot of people have been very disappointed. But at the same time, there is a learning curve. You need to understand how they work and what they are good at, what they are not. So that needs a little bit of time to get acquainted how these function and how one can benefit from it.
Yes, so I agree that things are emerging. So both tools are emerging and best practices are emerging. So maybe if you're not sure yet, maybe it's good to wait for a bit and see if your own research community, wherever you are publishing, comes up with guidelines. Like I was saying that my qualitative coding tool can give you some numbers about quality and so on, but I don't know what would be the kind of best practice, like how to report them in a paper and then how many how big test sets to code and all this. This needs to be discussed. And right now, I'm more working with the industry people. So for instance, Hype company where I worked part-time for a while, their tutorial team asked me to use this tool to dig topics that people need help with, their users. And that's something that they can internally evaluate whether that's trustworthy enough. And so the kind of risk level or the threshold for acceptable quality is lower than in research. And
I'm afraid there are lots and lots of ethical questions, but luckily I see many of the members of the FCAI ethics board here in the audience. They know better. But if thinking just strictly of the research process and what to publish and how to do my research, I think there are three factors to take into account in the use of these tools. One is if they are opaque, if they are black boxes or not. How much can I, as a scientist, understand what's going on? Can I look inside and see why it did something? The other dimension is what is the amount and nature of possible harm if something goes wrong. So for instance, if I'm correcting the style of my language, there's no big harm if the style goes, if it doesn't improve, or there's a wrong expression. And this connects to the third dimension, which is my expertise. How well am I able to judge the output and the results that I get? So again, using the style improvement as an example, I can check if the expression is improved. If it's in English that I don't understand, I wouldn't use it. I'd go back to my original one. So how opaque is it? What kind of harm might it result in? And can I keep control of myself? So these would be three dimensions along which to judge maybe what to use and when, because, well, the tools, the use cases are extremely different. In the end, the guiding principle, I think, would be or could be to require full transparency on the science itself. The science is a process, not the product. So transparency of that process. And even, like I said before, regardless of what tools I use, I need to be able to be fully transparent, not on my use of language models, but on the actual science, on the actual thinking and reasoning, arguments, data, and so on behind my claims.
Thank you. There's no clock anywhere here, so I'm not sure where we're going at time-wise, but if there are any questions here, Patrick, you can share the mic.
Mikko Sarela from Tekniikan Akateemiset Tech. I was wondering, at least until recent years, if you wanted to know how to speak or write anything, whether it be technical or essays or public speaking or whatever, you needed to learn how to speak. You needed to learn how to use words to think and to describe things that are attached to each other. And we know that language is also not only a method and a tool for communication, but it's also a tool for thinking. And I'm wondering, do you have opinions and ideas about what should we do when people are starting to use generative tools to help them with the communication part, so that our skills in the thinking part don't atrophy?
I can start and give others some time to think. I think that's a really interesting question. Language, text is not the message, the content. Language is a medium for that. And that's what easily fools us when we use language models. Language is a means for communicating content, and when we see language that has been generated without understanding of any content, we still see it there. But the point that you brought up about language writing being a tool for thinking, I think that's really interesting. And I'm not sure how we could best harness language models to help us do that. If there are ways of, I mean, it's easy to think at least of ways of using language models to generate ideas for us, or list a number of different viewpoints or aspects on a topic, and that might give us some food for thought. But I'm not sure if that addresses at all where you were getting at.
So maybe we just need to be intrinsically motivated learners and not be lazy. So it maybe requires more self-discipline to not just go to the language model. I don't know, maybe in the future the models can keep a log in a way that I would only use a model when I can't do something myself. But then the model would remember that you needed help with this, and then later on it could kind of quiz me, okay, can you now do it by yourself? Did you learn from what I created for you, or something like that, to work as a tutor? I don't know.
I can also reflect with it based on a very recent interaction I had with one of the obvious energy companies that I'm now negotiating my contract. It was funny, like I was using ChatGPT to craft my arguments, and their contact person also used the GPT to respond back to me. It was a very interesting debate, and then I realized that, okay, this is kind of very changing. I mean, coming to the brighter side, I mean, we didn't really settle anything because we were just using the AI to fight with each other. But in a way, I mean, if I look at science, there is a lot of jargon language. I mean, if you look at articles, like 40-page article, and then you have a hard time oftentimes find, okay, what is the implication? What is the exact value? And these language models probably are very good at condensing that. And if you think about the true nature of language, if it's about transforming information, if you're looking for a certain information in a large amount of context in a document, probably this can make us a little bit more efficient, you know, getting to the gist of the core of the conversation without going through all the, sometimes I don't necessarily say unnecessary, but not adequate for that particular point that we are looking for.
If I may still add, since we are academic mostly, and many of us, well, we are many of us from universities, teaching is an important part of our activities as well. And I think this concern is extremely relevant there. Writing is thinking, and thinking is learning. If our students misuse language models to produce something that maybe fulfills the criteria of the essay or whatever the task is, obviously that's not going to contribute to their learning. They need to write in order to think, and think in order to learn. So we need rules for that as well to make sure that language models are not misused to actually skip the learning part.
Jumping into another thing, aspect, which is privacy. And there are many different issues related to these large language models and privacy. First of all, as we probably usually don't know where the data is coming from, and when I asked ChatGPT what data it uses, and it says, I'm not using your personal data, but there might be personal data in my learning data. So it's sort of rather complicated to understand what is the sort of the privacy there. And then we start thinking like now if you sort of maybe a question that came already from the floor was like what does it mean if we generate data from people, like this qualitative data, and we turned it something else? So we're not violating their privacy as such, but we might be doing something that they not really didn't know they're part of. Things are being done and their data is being used, and there are several other aspects of privacy. One of course is like there are disclaimers: do not put private data or sensitive data here. But for example, if we have qualitative interviews and we can have in our atlas, we can use it. There's already AI, but I don't know where is it going. Is it somewhere? So there are many questions of privacy. Would you like to elaborate on some of them?
Yeah, right now the situation is not great for EU because OpenAI, ChatGPT, for instance, the servers or the data centers where it's computed, it's in US. And I just recently checked, even though you can also use the model through different providers like Microsoft Azure, you can't have it kind of processed in European data centers yet. It's kind of coming. So GDPR is an obstacle. And also, yeah, the training data. There's some class action lawsuits in this generative modeling going on that would, at least in US, I guess, sort out whether it's okay or not that they are trained on whatever data they've been able to scrape from the internet and so on, and clearly also copyrighted books and stuff. This legislation differs with each country, as far as I know. In some countries, using copyrighted data for AI training is allowed, some it's not, but this legislation also often doesn't make a difference between generative and other forms of AI, and yeah. It's interesting to see when the dust settles in a few years where we are. Yeah, I can't really say whether it's right or wrong to use these models right now. What we did with the data generation was a kind of experiment of scientific curiosity, and like I said, I'm not really pushing it forward now because of many issues.
In the early days of GPT-2, or was it even 3, we saw cases where personal information was leaked in the generation. So since the language model works by definition by imitation, sometimes it imitates exactly enough the source data it has seen, and so there were cases where it reproduced some personal information. Now there's been a lot of efforts, of course, to avoid that nowadays, but it's a gray area, and you never know what this model will produce. So they, of course, try to remove this kind of data, I guess, from the training data. How successful that is, I don't know. But if there's any of that left, and the model is based on, well, generalization primarily, but still imitation, there's the risk of information actually leaking out. But it would be extremely difficult and costly to make sure that that cannot happen. So what these companies are doing is moving fast and breaking things and then taking the lawsuits later on as they come.
One of the ways to mitigate these challenges is, again, to be on board with the research process. one of the dangers of using a top-of-the-shelf software, I don't name particular softwares, but they come about and say that we use AI, and you always have to ask a question that, okay, what AI? There's 400 more language models out there. How is that processed? Well, what is the license agreement I'm signing up? Where my data is actually going? And that requires to be a little bit more hands-on, because as a researcher, you can build a lot of pipelines in-house yourself. And this, again, reflecting that you don't necessarily need to be a data scientist or a machine learning expert. You can start to ask GPT to help you to build your own pipeline. And this was a material I had in my workshop, basically with 10 lines of code. You can start to process, for example, an article, extract certain thematics and analyze those qualitatively. And there you have a lot of control as a researcher, because you can import certain processes to make sure I am omitting any GDPR sensitive data. And these are something you can do locally. And that is an education of itself. And I recommend to always refer to Finnish IT Center for Science, CSC. They have a very nice set of guidelines, like what is sensitive data. And oftentimes you don't realize certain data are sensitive, but it's really good to go and check that out. And then always have these processes in line in your research to make it GDPR proof in a way, and be on top of your data rather than just like using a software and shipping everything out.
Yeah, thanks. Just one idea I've been thinking of also, then I will go to the floor, is not generating research data as such, but for example, I always use quotes, and I'm afraid in the publications that somebody might be recognized. So could they be used like generating quotes that sort of represent the research material or something like that, that would actually help protecting privacy of the informants, etc. So there might be many uses that would help the privacy of the individuals. But any questions from the floor? Yeah.
Yeah. Big surprise of last year was that to what extent creative work can be automated. And the research is analytical, but it's both very creative. It's also a very creative process, a pursuit at least. And then if one takes this hierarchy of problems, there's the wicked, hard, and easy problems. Many of these examples highlight to what productivity boost can be obtained in choosing a method to solve a problem or implementing it. But then, what about the wicked problem, choosing what problem to solve? And there's been a lot of mention of this concept of black box. And here, really, the black box of researchers' intuition is in play. And here, in my experience as a computational scientist, this intuition can be at least augmented and to some extent automated through large language models and some programming on the side. And basically, I couldn't compete with me without these models at this state. So how should this be reflected in the education of researchers? And yeah, how do you see this in general? Yeah, long question, sorry.
I think for many creative tasks outside science, they can be impressive tools to really boost one's creativity, because then it's not the factual correctness that is at stake or the argumentation behind things and so on. You are allowed to fabricate things freely. So for creative endeavors outside science, yes, great. Within science, I'm sure language models can be used in a beneficial way for all kinds of ideation, for instance, in order to provide ideas to me as a scientist, where I'm not taking these ideas as ground truths, but rather as ideas that might be interesting to investigate further on. So I think there's a lot of potential there, for instance.
Yeah, in general, I guess what one can say is that these tools have a kind of democratizing effect, so that if you think of the kind of distribution of outputs, whatever it is, research papers or things that people produce, or paintings, 3D models in creative professions, with AI tools, the average quality goes up, But AI usually is limited by its training data and the fine-tuning instruction and all that. So the kind of top of the top is hard to beat with these AI tools. So it tends to make, it's kind of affects the economics of the system if it's a competitive system like research unfortunately is. So in a sense, there's pressure to adopt these tools to kind of stay afloat on top of the competition, but it will be interesting to see whether if you are already kind of performing at the top of your game, if it's any use. So, okay, anecdote. I saw on Reddit somebody was asking for ChatGPT advice. So telling that they are a prospective student, maybe PhD student, something, and they want to approach and send emails to professors. So read their papers, send a cold call email, and propose collaboration. But then I realized there's too many papers to read and too many professors. So can I have ChatGPT read these papers and write these emails for me and suggest, dear Professor X, can we collaborate on this topic? I like your paper. And I, as a professor, was like, okay, whoa. Because, of course, so, but I don't think these proposals would be the most stellar ones. So it's just increasing noise in the system. But I don't know, how probably the best work will still filter and float on top. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but yeah.
Yeah, if I want to add on top, and we often see these benchmarks. For example, GPT-4 is performing better than a lawyer based on the benchmarks. But again, I mean, that's again the question. Like, if a lawyer's job is to just do a test, well, GPT is performing that better eventually. But we know that lawyers or many other jobs are beyond that, just doing a test. And that's again kind of a reflection back to researchers. Like, are we just collecting data or creating thematics or analyzing? I think it's much more than that. And of course, the stake is higher. You need to do more creative tasks. You need to do more. If you are a researcher just doing that, probably like a proofreader, your job is on the stake. But I've seen like many have had this existential crisis that, eventually I have to elevate my capabilities because, I mean, if this is a discussion we are now having at 2023, what will be the case in 2027?
Questions from the audience, and can somebody shout me the time where we are going? It's 30. Okay, thank you. Okay, great. Yeah.
All right. Okay, so I have the following question. Well, I'm not sure it's a question or a rant, but let's see where we go from here. So I think like one of the biggest abuses that you can do with ChatGPT is to just generate content, so like low effort content in a sense. And you can see this, for example, like Stack Overflow was mentioned. For example, Stack Overflow doesn't allow ChatGPT answers there because they need to be written by humans. Same thing with some subreddits. They don't allow that behavior. And there's lots of structured places in our society, I feel, that rely on the fact that the content is written by a human being. So, for example, like I did an experiment a few days ago when I just wrote to ChatGPT, I'm a middle manager, please write me a motivational letter to my employees. And it gave me one. It was a very soul-crushing letter, so I can just... So if I'm an employee and I get this letter, like why should I read it? Why should I use my finite time to read this text? Same thing like if I'm reviewing a paper, a research paper, if the introduction section, for example, was written by ChatGPT, why should I read it? It's like very low effort was done to produce it. Why should I use why should I use high effort to actually, to understand what was said by ChatGPT? Like,
Yeah, I don't know what can I say, but I know the feeling. As a reviewer, I've several times wrote back in either in the confidential part or not so confidential part that this text looks like it could have been written by a language model, and that's not a compliment. As a teacher, we face the same problem as you know well. We end up reading texts that we don't always know if they are the result of an intellectual effort by the student, as they are supposed to be, or if they are produced automatically. Yeah, it's a big question. What to do with this situation? Should we take actions to prevent some of it, or should we just? I mean, we can't afford all the extra effort in reviewing these materials that are not interesting because they are not the results of human intellectual work. They might be just sort of by coincidence, but that's a coincidence then.
Yeah, I think we need to change our evaluations. I've been mostly thinking about students applying to Aalto, to the master's major that I'm heading. We, for instance, got rid of the introduction letters now because of ChatGPT. I'm not going to read any of those because, yeah, it started to show already last time. Instead, now students submit a video intro. It's at least harder to fake. They can, of course, write the script with ChatGPT, but there has to be something else. I don't know if that will work out. This is an experiment, but clearly something needs to be done. About paper reviewing, yeah, that's harder because can you be sure? And if you can't be 100% sure it's ChatGPT, which you can't, then you can't make a decision based on that. So, because it's a kind of high risk, important decision. And then I don't know, maybe conferences, journals, we should start to value concise papers more or give some kind of scoring based on how short and to the point it is, because so that people at least don't generate long texts to waste people's time. I don't know.
If I want to also reflect as an associate editor in a journal, there is a supply-demand problem. Now, by some measures, it's very evident that there is some percentage point increase on journal submissions because a lot of people get assistance with these language models. And on the same side, on the journal side, you always have this problem with the editors and the reviewers. So we have a very big problem with the reviewers' time and the whole rewarding system around how reviewers are rewarded. So now you can see that there's a lot of supply and there's a lot of there's much less resource for evaluation. And one of the big publishing houses also emailed, I think 2 weeks ago, some of my colleagues also got it, that in no ways as a reviewer you're allowed to put the content of the submitter into a language models. But anyways, I know that they are working on some measures to also assist the whole process with the language models. So in a way, we are getting some sort of assistance with these oversupply of content, because otherwise this is not a very easy battle. You're basically putting generated content by AI into the human eye, which is it's not in the same level of resource offering.
I'm afraid the problem will only become more complicated because it's not binary, the text either produced by an AI system or written by a human, but actually humans using either in good ways or sometimes less good ways different tools to work on their ideas, to produce the ideas, to express them, to polish the writing and so on. So it will be a much more difficult effort to sort of tell apart the human contribution from the potential machine contribution. And again, transparency is something we should expect and require. Then, of course, the counter-argument is that, okay, people can still cheat in what they tell about their methods and leave something out and so on. But I think transparency is one of the keys here.
And of course, it can be turned the other way around, whether it's the one reviewing the paper or reviewing research applications. If they're generated by AI, then also the reading can be aided with AI. And then it comes what Arash said, well, you were arguing helped by ChatGPT, and the other one was as well. So we might generate these systems that just work by themselves, and then we are left to do the real research ourselves. So maybe although like Academy of Finland has this, everybody's tackling with the sustainability and all sorts of things you have to write there, so there will be just, okay, it's written and it's read. So I have it's a joke, but it's also a very relevant question in a way that we could actually end up in a situation where some things are produced with the help of AI and we are left to do the things that we are good at and the AI is not good at. But there's a balance going on, and especially, and there's also the understanding of like what these language models are. I love, they are not models of the world, they're models of language, and I think this is one of the most problematic sort of ethical points, because people don't really understand what they're dealing with when they're using AI and ChatGPTs, etc. So any other questions from the audience? Yep.
Comment a thing. You were talking about your discussion with the electricity company and referring to what you just were saying. So did I understand it was a failure that the two ChatGPTs talked to each other and there was no end result, so you couldn't just go away and wait until you get an end result to it? So what happened?
Well, I have to recall, I mean, honestly, I didn't pick up that conversation because we were basically in a loop. So I was reinforcing my arguments, they were reinforcing the argument. But I realized that, you know, the first impression is that you feel that you have an advantage, but then you realize that, you know, it's also been used by others, and then how that become an advantage. In that instance, we couldn't really solve because there wasn't a lot of maneuverability within my argument to push it further, but at least there was a communication happening. So there was information transmitted from their side in a nice wording, you know, it was very polite. I kind of like that when I was reading it, that they're very polite, but at the same time, they're highlighting certain things. And I was polite and, you know, I was highlighting other things. It kind of helped the flow of conversation, I should say, at least in that instance, which was maybe not a very good use case probably for that.
This brings to me also a question. We already talked about there are several languages that are not supported with ChatGPT, etc. So there are, in a way, there are losers in that sense, and then people with skills to sort of come out are the winners. But if we start thinking, always technology, it has like losers and winners, those who gain and those who benefit. In the field of research, who are the ones who benefit? Who are the losers? Maybe a difficult question.
I feel like, okay, this is stupid to say, but I feel like I'm a winner in the sense that I'm interested in player experiences. And now I feel I can tackle data sets that were too big to analyze before. And I don't yet know whether it will work out and how interesting and reliable the findings are. But there are at least some niches where I think people can find gains. But who are the losers? Like, well, obviously access to this technology is one. And I think maybe right now, in a way, people in the US might be winners because, well, they don't need to worry about GDPR, for instance. I guess it's often like this, that the countries that produce the technology, that it's either implicitly or explicitly kind of optimized for them. I'm sure if OpenAI was a new EU company, they would have kind of figured out this data privacy issue better.
I think we talk a lot about democratizing. I had a slide on it, but at the same time, it also divides because these language models are very expensive. We have to note that. In one of my contents, I actually put an experiment that for one language model for like 1,000 of a task, you might end up paying $2. But if you change that language model, basically changing one of the derivatives of the GPT-3 to, for example, GPT-4, longer time window, you end up from $2 to $4,000. So in a way, there's a lot of variation in terms of quality and the type of things you can get from it. And when the monetary aspect comes to it, then it's always the question that the ones who get the money and have the resources, they are able to use the better quality stuff. And we know that we are not living in a very homogeneous world. There's gaps and divides and everything. So then that aspect will also create more divide. The ones with more access to resources, they are able to utilize the more powerful things than the ones who don't have.
So if you think about, for example, the access and the payments that ChatGPT also has, should universities and research institutes have a sort of a system that, yes, we all get as researchers the better one with more qualities that has to be paid for? Or are these sort of the things that institutions should support or not? Because these are like, do I pay it myself? Can I get my project to pay it for? Or should this be something infrastructure supported by universities and research institutes?
Yes, I think that at least in Finland, it would be good to get those open language models, the Llama 2 models, for instance, right now, and those derived from it, to run on the Finnish computational infrastructure like Aalto's Triton cluster and CSC, make that as easily available to researchers as possible. Maybe there's some resources that could be spent on it. I know people in Aalto have already experimented with this, but it's not like super easily accessible if you are not a computer scientist, and even for many kind of learning to use it via this Triton cluster, for instance, it requires some learning. So yeah, we should build that access internally to the open models that we kind of know as well as one can know what has gone inside. And that's not that hard to build. We have the resources, they take some amount of GPUs, we have quite many of them, because there's been this huge community effort after Llama came out to optimize these models for smaller hardware. Mm-hmm. These models still, the biggest models, the best models, they can't run on your desktop PC, but because people have tried to crunch them, there are now techniques that you can quantize them to 8-bit, 4-bit. There's kind of improved fine-tuning methods that allow you to fine-tune these models with much less memory. So it's becoming kind of accessible if we make a bit of effort to kind of just make sure that these models are available through the national infrastructure.
I don't have much of a detailed answer as Perttu, but one thing I would like to emphasize is that we are living in a competitive world. So if we don't get to find ways to use it, definitely competitors are using it, and we are losing time to catch later on.
Thanks. There's a question.
Okay, thank you for this very interesting discussion. I take up a detail, but I think it's really essential. What irritates me when we discuss these things is that there are so many acronyms. And even if, Hannu, thank you for your introduction to the theme, but no one has spoken. We all use these ChatGPT, And perhaps I was the only one who had to Google. So what is the meaning behind these magic letters? And I think it is alienating for the general public that the experts nearly never say what the AI and LLM and GPT, it doesn't make any sense. So even if generative pre-trained transformer doesn't say much, but it gives an idea, and then perhaps it would, if we said aloud these words, it would then also help us in the discussion. But I think there is something that in many of the articles and in expert language, so much acronyms appear. So I think it would help us all and enhance general understanding if we took a few more seconds to speak aloud these words. Thank you.
Point taken, thank you. The next question then would be, what is a transformer? And we would need another 2 hours to go into that.
Thank you. This is I would say this is a very essential point for our discussion. We need more sort of a down-to-earth ways of discussing and understanding this very complex technology and phenomena, because it's both a technology and phenomena. We are dealing with change. Arash said, like, what is happening now, 23, what will happen in 27, we really don't know. We're gonna wrap up, we got just a couple of minutes. If you want to have any like futuristic visions, short visions, what you want to share, where we're going, what good or bad will happen in, well, just a couple of years' time.
I don't make predictions, but let me just say that we are living in interesting times.
Don't have much to add to that. I hope, I see there's a risk that, for instance, Meta, so previously Facebook, will backpedal on their stance on open source. I really hope they don't, because they are the kind of only big company, because basically only the big technology companies have the resources to train these models, develop the models, because a single training run, for instance, could be run if we book a lot of resources at Lumi, for instance. But usually you need multiple runs, and then we've used all Finland's quota for many years on Lumi or something like that. Anyway, so the big companies have the resources, tens of thousands of GPU clusters, graphics processing unit, these are the point taken. So these are the computer chips that do the processing. And Meta has been the only company who has been putting their models out in the open for anyone to use, even commercially now with the latest release. And if they say that's no longer possible, I don't know, that would be a big hit to the transparency and accessibility and all that. So I hope they keep doing open source and other companies join that.
Thanks. Arash.
I think the trend which I'm kind of observing is that we are entering to the phase that these language models, their utility will become limited. And this is a reflection to like the lawsuits that are happening. What has happened is that the effort of OpenAI to, commercialize this thing really woke up a lot of entities that, their data has a value. Basically, whatever has been scraped and thus like laying around in archives, if combined like that, there is a value. And this will eventually lead to the phase that we will see that everybody is basically putting walls around their data. Like in the GPT-5 effort, we also heard a lot about that Reddit didn't give access, Twitter revoked the access, so it's, eventually that will become much, much more limited. So we are entering to the phase that more specialized, more limited for particular task language models will come out. And in a way, we are kind of living now in a Wild West era that it's fairly available to experiment, and I don't think that this will last for long. From my personal kind of acquainting with this, I always try to remind myself, if this task that I'm doing, can it be done efficiently, considering that I have such a tool very close to me. And this is a part of the learning process that kind of helping myself and people in immediate proximity of myself to remind that there is a tool, this exists, this has a power. Think how else you can do your work with that, which eventually leaves you free time to do other interesting stuff.
Thank you. Thank you, Arash. Thank you, Perttu. Thank you, Hannu. We're going to end this discussion, but we're going to continue with it later on. Thank you.